Welcome to the latest installment of the Influencers series, and in this episode I profile a man who had a tremendous impact on the history of secular progress, Baruch or Benedict Spinoza. The biographical information presented in this video is extracted from my book, In Progress, Dangerous Ideas. Spinoza and Hobbes have an entire chapter to themselves in my book, and I have made every effort to summarize the important content as thoroughly as possible, and while cutting out a tremendous amount of subject matter, I need to split this biography into two parts: the introduction with contextual background, and a deep dive into his arguments in the Theological-Political Treatise and the repercussions. Therefore, in the interests of time, I have condensed and/or skipped a lot of information that is available in the book for those wanting a more thorough deconstruction. Spinoza is an extremely enigmatic figure to pin down, partly because of the times in which he lived when it was extremely dangerous to state outright what one really thought, and because he said things in his private letters that often contradicted what he said in his writings, examples of which will be provided as this overview progresses. The universal dogmas covered in this quote by Hyman, which I will explore in detail in part 2, are a perfect example of Spinoza's guarded circumlocutions. In 1669 or 1670, Spinoza published the Theological-Political Treatise, known generally as the TTP from the Latin title Tractatus Theologico-Politicus in the Netherlands. As the name of Spinoza's work implies, the book deals with theological issues to make political points, specifically that clerics should stop interfering in civil matters. The primary focus of the book called for intellectual freedom from religious obstructionism and to lay the groundwork for his other work, Ethics, which he had set aside writing to work on the TTP. Spinoza not only took the precaution of publishing the TTP anonymously, but also listed a different city of publication, Hamburg, and cited a fictitious publisher, Henry Kunrat. Spinoza's caution further undermines his claim that in Holland, as he wrote in the TTP, we happen to have that rare good fortune that we live in a republic in which everyone is granted complete freedom of judgment. Contrary to what Spinoza wrote in the TTP about the freedoms in the Dutch Republic, in Letter 30 he revealed what he truly thought about the prejudices of the theologians and his motive for exposing them and removing them from the minds of the more prudent. Roughly 2/3 of the TTP's content is biblical analysis, textual criticism, deconstructions, and often reinterpretations of traditional views. From a modern context, it is tempting to think this level of detail is excessive and that his arguments could have been dramatically more concise. But we must remember the times he was living in when religious authority had the power to kill people. Spinoza's rigorous scriptural deconstructions and application of different approaches in the TTP, such as linguistic analysis, gave rise to the modern discipline of textual criticism, and his unique background, an excommunicated Jew from a Portuguese immigrant family who was fluent in Hebrew and educated in the Jewish schools of Amsterdam, gave him unique insights and skills other thinkers of his day did not possess to dissect the Hebrew Bible. Before exploring Spinoza's theological arguments in detail, it is first helpful to understand his conception of God as it forms the foundation of his subsequent points in the TTP. In Ethics, Spinoza set out to create a wholly new moral philosophy, the first in modern European history to be based on a humanist ethic and not a theological one. However, his plan to prepare the field backfired given the outrage that the TTP generated, and subsequently Ethics was not published until after his death in 1677. It was in Ethics that he laid out his proof for the existence of God. Spinoza's deliberate choice to use the word God has confused people about what he meant for centuries, and it is obvious why this term would lead to exactly the misunderstanding it continues to generate. Perhaps he needed to exercise caution in a heavily theistic society that imprisoned and killed people for denying the existence of a heavenly creator, or perhaps he just wanted to use terminology that people were familiar with to relate his concepts about the creation of the universe. When Spinoza's Proposition 11 is read using the word nature instead of God or substance, it becomes apparent he is simply asserting that the universe follows the laws of physics, which later science has clearly shown that it does. In this reading, his argument is simply repeating an argument put forth by ancient Greeks. Indeed, Graham Oppy, who specializes in the philosophy of religion, provides a detailed account of the history and types of ontological arguments and the invalid nature of their construction, categorizing Spinoza's proof as a mereological argument, meaning it simply rationalizes the existence of the physical universe. Spinoza's conception of God is important for the advancement of secularism. His premise that God was just the impersonal force of nature removed from the concerns of humanity played a major role in his attempt to deprive the religious leaders of his day of their biblically claimed authority to meddle in society. By arguing that God is indistinguishable from nature and that millennia of Jewish and Christian priests had perverted the true nature of religion, Spinoza makes the case that their self-appointed authority was just as made up as the flimsy dogmas they had invented in order to subvert and control the populace. As outlined in the Vatican Lies series on the Catholic Church's accumulation of power and domination in Western Europe, where religious authorities repeatedly sought to repress intellectual freedom, the same was true in Protestant Holland. That Calvinist interference was a danger to stability in the Dutch Republic was central to Spinoza's premise in the TTP, and why he drew parallels to the Jewish priests and their grasping political power, which led to the collapse of the state of Judah. Therefore, he claims, the sovereign power should have complete authority in all matters, including religion, in order to ensure peace and end sectarian divisions. In formulating his concept for this ideal state, Spinoza made one of the most eloquent arguments for secular democracy and for why the TTP is essential in understanding the history of dangerous ideas in the evolution of freedom of thought. While many scholars dispute when the Enlightenment properly began, most putting it in the late 18th century, Spinoza's TTP definitively ceded the ground and influenced many of the revolutionary thinkers that came after him. Jonathan Israel, a professor with an expertise in Dutch and Enlightenment history, distinguishes between the radical and moderate arms of the Enlightenment. Israel credits Spinoza with being foundational to the radical side and its unflinching call for the checking of religious authority in order to ensure democratic freedoms, as opposed to Descartes, Hobbes, and Locke on the moderate side who conceded some measure of validity to religion. Spinoza decided the best way to make his case for freedom of thought was to amply demonstrate in all the ways the Church Fathers were wrong, in order to remove their shackles from the minds of the men trying to advance society. Spinoza made the targets of his attention clear, mocking those who would hinder progress for the sake of tradition. Judging from the rising numbers of non-believers in the 21st century, highly secular Western Europe, and the corresponding rapid decline in church attendance, Spinoza was correct that knowledge is the key for attenuating religious authority in the socio-political sphere, though he might loathe the exponential growth of atheism that came hand in hand with the dwindling wonder of fools, especially as such rigorous secularism was sparked by his own arguments. Many of the ideas Spinoza put forward were not his own, such as the fact that Moses could not have been the author of the entire Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Torah. Ibn Ezra argued in the 1100s, as did others including Hobbes, that since the last chapter of Deuteronomy described the death of Moses, he obviously could not have written all of it, so it was not new for him to critique the Bible and its stories. What was new for Spinoza was taking his conclusions as far as he did in showing just how much the text and traditions had been corrupted by priests for millennia, and what that meant, by implication, for the clerics of his day. Specifically, Spinoza passionately advocates for socio-political and intellectual freedom from religious interference, arguing the religious authorities needed to be shunted off their self-appointed and ill-gotten pedestals. Even Hobbes was shocked by the lengths to which Spinoza went, and was quoted as saying, Spinoza, "Cut through me a bar's length, for I durst not write so boldly." If you like my content, please like and subscribe to get notified of new videos. Please also consider supporting my work by becoming a Patreon sponsor. You can also find me on the following platforms.